By spring, James Whitfield would still be alive. His wife would still be standing in the kitchen. His children would still sit at the same table. Nate would still be working the field. But the farm would be smaller. The ledger would not be clean. And every person on that land would carry something through the winter that they had not carried into it. It started with a leaf that was the wrong color. That was all. Not a storm, not a flood, not a fire. Just a tobacco leaf on a July morning in Colonial, Virginia, around 1720. That was slightly wrong in a way that only a man who had farmed this land for 11 years would recognize. James recognized it. He walked back to the house without saying a word. What followed was not a single catastrophe. It was the kind of year that arrived quietly and then took everything it could reach. One thing at a time, in the particular order that hard years always take things. First the crop, then the money, then the land, then the pride, then the question that sat in the corn crib all winter like something alive. 5 people lived on this farm. Each of them knew something the others did not. Each of them carried a number, a fear, a calculation they had not shared. And when the harvest failed, it did not fail equally for all of them. It never does. The tobacco leaves were not the right color. James had been farming long enough to know what that meant. He walked back to the house without saying a word. It was late July, on a farm that sat within reach of Yorktown by water. The tributary ran below the south edge of the property. Quiet enough that morning that James could hear it from the top of the hill. He had heard it every morning for 11 years. Most mornings it was just sound. That morning, it reminded him that Calder's boat had come up that same water last month to collect what remained of the previous year's crop, and that Calder would come again in November, and that November was not far enough away. He stood at the edge of the field and looked down the first row. The leaves on the outer plants had gone a shade lighter than they should have been in late July. Not yellow, not spotted, just slightly wrong. The way a face looks slightly wrong when someone is coming down with a fever and does not know it yet. A person who had never grown tobacco would have walked past those plants and thought nothing. James had grown tobacco for 11 years on this land, and he stood at the edge of the row and felt something drop in his chest, the way a stone drops into still water. He did not touch the leaves. He walked the length of the row without stopping, looking at the plants the way a man looks at something he is hoping will look better the longer he studies it. It did not look better. At the far end of the row he turned and walked back, slower this time, and the color was the same all the way down. He went inside for breakfast without telling Margaret what he had seen. The house was a wood frame structure that James had built in pieces over the first 4 years on this land, adding a room when he had the timber and the time. Margaret had put things on the walls and made the floors clean, and arranged the furniture so that the misaligned doorways seemed like choices rather than mistakes. James had noticed this without ever saying anything about it. It was one of the things he knew about his wife that he had never found the words for. She was at the fire when he came in, stirring something in the iron pot that smelled like cornmeal and salt pork. Hannah was beside her, learning the motion of the spoon. The girl was 13, and her hands had gotten her mother's shape, long-fingered and capable. Eli was already outside. At 16, he rose before James on most mornings and went directly to whatever needed doing without being told. James had not taught him this. The farm had taught him. James sat down and ate his breakfast, and said nothing about the color of the leaves. Margaret asked if he had slept. He said well enough. She looked at him in the way she had of looking at him when she knew the answer before she asked the question, and she did not ask anything else. Outside, the field ran up the eastern slope in rows that looked from the house like something orderly and intentional. That morning, they looked like a problem he had not yet figured out how to name. He finished his breakfast and went back out. Nate was already in the field. Nate had been on this farm for 6 years. He worked the tobacco rows with the efficiency of someone who had done this long enough that the individual motions had stopped being things he thought about. He moved through the plants, checking leaves the way James moved through them. But from the other end of the field, working toward the middle, while James worked from the top. He was not checking the plants by looking. He was checking them by touch, running his fingers along the underside of leaves, feeling for things that eyes missed in the early light. James had watched him do this many times. He had adjusted his own technique based on what he observed, and his yields in the 3rd year had improved. He had never said to anyone where the adjustment came from. They worked toward each other without speaking. The sound of the tributary running below them and the early light coming flat across the hills to the east. They met in the middle of the 7th row. James looked at the leaf Nate was holding. Nate looked at the same leaf without looking at James. 2 men, same field, same morning. Neither of them said anything. Neither of them needed to. Tobacco was not just a crop. In much of colonial Virginia, it functioned like money, often enough that a man could feel ruined without ever seeing a coin. When James needed to settle with Calder, he did not reach for coins. When the parish collected its annual tithe, it did not ask for silver. When a man in this part of Virginia needed salt or cloth or nails or gunpowder, he paid in leaf. The leaf was the coin. The field was the mint. And this year, the mint was failing. That night, James sat down with his ledger. He did this every evening, or tried to. The ledger was a small book with a dark cover that he had bought in Williamsburg 4 years earlier, and the pages were filled with numbers in his own handwriting, columns of figures that tracked what the farm produced and what the farm owed and the distance between those two things. He kept it on a shelf above the table where he ate, and Margaret never touched it, and neither did the children, because the ledger was the place where James kept the parts of his life that were too precise to carry only in his head. He opened it to the current page and looked at what he had written 3 weeks ago, when the season had still felt like something he could predict. 800 pounds. That was what he owed Calder from the year before, when he had extended his credit to purchase the 20 acres along the eastern edge of the property. He had believed, at the time of purchase, that the additional acreage would increase his planting capacity enough to make the debt worth carrying. He had written it at the top of the page, in the careful hand he used for numbers that mattered. Below that, 600 pounds for the county levy and the parish tithe, both collected in tobacco, both non-negotiable. To James, the county levy, the parish tithe, and the colonial government's demands were different names on different obligations, but all of them reached the farm through the same narrow door, which was what the harvest could pay. Below that, 600 pounds for winter goods, salt, cloth, iron nails for the eastern fence, gunpowder, a bolt of linen for Margaret. These were the things that could not be made on the farm and had to come from somewhere, which meant they had to come from a merchant, which meant they had to be paid for in tobacco. And below that, in handwriting, slightly more careful than the lines above, he had written £400 as a reserve. This was the line that told the story of what kind of year he had believed this would be. £400 of reserve meant a man who was not just surviving, but building something. £400 meant a man who had finally, after 11 years, gotten far enough ahead to have something left over. £2,400. That was what the page said he needed. He picked up his pen. He held it over the page. He put it back down without writing anything. The number out in the field was not £2,400. He had known this for weeks. He had simply not been ready to write it down, because a number written in the ledger was a number that existed in the world, and a number that existed in the world had to be dealt with. He was not yet sure he knew how to deal with what that number was going to be. He closed the ledger without writing anything. Outside, the tributary was moving through the dark toward Yorktown. He could not see the river from where he sat. He could hear it. He had heard it every night for 11 years. And most nights, it was just sound. Tonight, it sounded like a thing moving away from him in the dark, carrying the portion of everything he had worked for that belonged to other people. He left the ledger on the table. He went to bed. He did not sleep for a long time. Margaret opened the corn crib on a Tuesday morning in early August. She did this the way she did most things, without announcing it, without asking anyone to come with her. She lifted the wooden latch, pulled the door open, and stood in the entrance while her eyes adjusted to the dim interior. The crib held the remainder of last year's corn. There was still a reasonable amount stacked in ears along the side walls, the dried husks pale and papery in the low light. A person walking past and glancing in would have thought it looked fine. Margaret did not glance. She counted. She counted the way she counted everything, which was not by moving her lips or making marks on paper, but by a kind of internal arithmetic that she had been running for so long, it no longer felt like arithmetic. It felt like knowing. She had learned this from her mother, who had learned it from hers. And it was not a skill that anyone had given a name to or written down anywhere, because it was the kind of skill that belonged to women in houses like this one, invisible and essential, and never entered into any ledger. She closed the door and latched it and went back to the house. She did not tell James what she had found, not because she was keeping it from him, because he had not asked, and because there was a difference between information and conversation, and what she had just gathered was information, and she was not ready to have the conversation it pointed toward. Not yet. Inside the house, she went back to the bread she had been making. She worked the dough with her hands the way her hands knew how, and she thought about what she had counted, and she thought about the tobacco field she could see through the window, and she thought about the difference between those two things. Tobacco was what James grew for other people, for Calder, who sent it to London, where men in buildings she would never see sold it to other men for money that traveled back across the ocean in the form of credit on a ledger page. Somewhere in that long chain of exchange, James got a portion that he used to pay the debts he had taken on to grow the tobacco in the first place. Corn was what she grew for this family. Not just grew, but managed and stored and rationed and protected. Because corn was not a crop that went to market. Corn was the thing between her children and hunger. It was the meal in the pot every morning, and the bread on the table at night, and the feed for the animals that pulled the plow, that made it possible to grow the tobacco, that paid the debts that kept Calder from taking the land, that the corn grew on, when only one of them had a bad year. A family like this one could manage. A bad tobacco year meant debt carried forward, credit stretched thinner. A harder conversation with Calder in November, painful but survivable. A bad corn year meant something different. It meant the counting in the corn crib started coming out wrong, and the meals started getting thinner, and the children started going to bed with a hunger that sleep did not entirely fix. This year, both fields were struggling. Margaret pressed her knuckles into the dough and turned it, and pressed again. Eli appeared in the doorway the way he appeared in doorways, which was without sound. At 16, he had grown tall enough that he had to duck slightly to come through the frame. A development of the past year that still surprised her sometimes. He had James's shoulders now, and James's way of standing when he was thinking about something he was not going to say. He poured himself water from the bucket by the door and drank it standing up. Looking out the window at the field, she watched him look at the field. He had not said anything to her about the tobacco, and she had not said anything to him. But Eli had been in the field every day for weeks. He had eyes. He had counted things himself. She was certain of it, because he was James's son, and James's sons counted things. And what Eli had counted in those rows had produced a number he was now carrying around behind his face without anyone asking him to put it down. He set the cup back by the bucket. He went back outside without saying anything. Hannah came in from the garden a few minutes later with a basket of early beans. Her dress damp from the morning dew on the plants. She set the basket down and began sorting the beans the way Margaret had shown her. The good ones to one side, and the ones that needed to be used immediately to the other. Margaret watched her daughter's hands work through the beans. In the spring, a man named Davies, whose family farmed 3 miles to the north, had come by on a Sunday after services and talked with James about various things for the length of a pleasant afternoon. Before he left, he had mentioned, in a way, meant to sound like a passing thought, that his son William was 17 now and a hard worker, and that the Davies family thought well of the Whitfield family. Always had, James had said. That was kind of him to say. Margaret had been inside making tea and had heard the conversation through the open window. She had not told Hannah about it. Hannah was 13, and she was sorting beans in her mother's kitchen. She did not need to know yet that the world had already begun to measure her in ways that had nothing to do with what she wanted or who she was going to become. There would be time for that knowledge. Margaret was going to hold it off as long as she could. She pressed the dough flat against the board. Outside, the tobacco field sat in the morning light, wrong-colored and quiet. In the corn crib, the ears were stacked the way she had left them. Margaret had a number in her head now. She had gotten it from the corn crib that morning, and it was the number of days before the corn ran out, calculated against the number of mouths that needed to be fed and the number of meals those mouths expected each day. She knew how many meals were left. What she did not know was which person in this house would become the first calculation. The eastern fence went down on a Wednesday. Not all of it. a section of 6 posts along the lower end of the pasture, where the ground had been soft since the spring rains, and the wood had been in the earth long enough that the rot had moved up from the base without anyone noticing. The whole section leaned far enough south that the older of the 2 hogs pushed through it before the sun was fully up. James found out about the hog when Hannah came running to the field with the expression of a child bringing news she knows is going to make an adult unhappy. He put down what he was carrying and walked back to the house without a word. Eli followed him. By the time they got there, the hog had gotten into the bean rows along the south wall, and the damage was done. A morning's worth of Hannah's work rooted up and scattered across the dark soil. James got the hog back through the gap in the fence. He stood looking at the garden for a moment. Then at the fence. Then at the garden again. Then he looked at Eli. He said the fence needed to be fixed today. Eli said he knew. He had said that 3 weeks ago. James looked at him. Eli looked back. There was a silence between them, of the kind that accumulates between fathers and sons, who are too similar to argue efficiently. Then James picked up his tools and went back to the tobacco rows. And Eli went to find the fence posts. There were not enough nails. Eli discovered this after he had pulled the rotted posts and dug the holes for the new ones. He went to the barn for nails and found the tin nearly empty. He counted what was there. He counted what the job needed. He did the fence with what he had. Some posts held with fewer nails than was right. The whole section was solid enough for now, but would need attention before winter. He did not tell his father how many nails he had used, because that would lead to a conversation about purchasing more from Calder's store, which would lead to a conversation about credit. And Eli had heard enough of that conversation this year. By noon the fence was standing. This was the shape of a day on this farm. There was the work that was planned, and the work that the morning produced without warning. And the difference between them was usually resolved by someone doing more than they expected, and saying less about it than they felt. His mother was in the house, managing things that had no name in any ledger. She had been up before anyone else, as she always was. She had started the fire and heated the water and made the meal that put everyone else in a condition to work. And then she had done her own work. She knew how much flour was in the barrel. She knew how much salt was left in the crock. She knew which of the laying hens had stopped laying and would need to be replaced before the cold came, and whether that replacement would have to come from their own flock or from a trade. And if a trade, what they had that was worth trading. None of this appeared in the ledger above the fireplace. The ledger tracked tobacco and debt and credit and the annual obligations to the county and the parish. It was a record of the farm's relationship with the world outside. Margaret's arithmetic was a record of the farm's relationship with the next meal. In a normal year, the two systems ran alongside each other without much friction. This was not shaping up to be a normal year. Nate moved through the tobacco rows on the far side of the field, doing the inspection James had assigned that morning, checking the condition of the upper leaves on each plant. He moved slowly down each row, his hands reading the underside of leaves, the way a man reads a page, one line at a time. He had been on this farm for 6 years. In those years, he had learned the particular personality of this soil, which was different from the soil 2 miles north, and different again from the soil along the lower reach of the tributary. Thinner in some places and richer in others. James understood the field in general. Nate understood it in the specific, because James walked the field and Nate worked in it. And the difference between those two relationships with the same piece of ground was the difference between knowing something and knowing it in your hands. He found 3 plants in the upper field that were worse than the ones James had looked at that morning. He looked at those plants for a while. Then he moved to the next row and continued the inspection without going to find James. He would report what he found at the end of the day. When James asked him, he would not volunteer the 3 plants before then. The information was not going to change anything between now and evening, and there was no version of delivering it early that made the day go better for anyone. This was something Nate had learned about how information moved on a farm like this one, and it was a lesson he had arrived at through experiences he did not revisit unless he had a reason to. The sun moved across the field. By sundown, everyone had done more than they had expected to do and said less about it than they felt. The fence was standing. The tobacco had been inspected. The hog was back in the pasture. Hannah had replanted what could be replanted in the kitchen garden. James sat on the step outside the house in the last light and looked at the field. A farm could survive a day while still failing as a year. He was beginning to understand that this was the kind of year it was going to be. It had not rained in 19 days. James knew this because he had been counting since the last real rain, which had come on a Sunday night in mid-July and had lasted long enough to wet the ground, but not long enough to do what the ground needed. He had watched it from the doorway that night, the rain coming down in the dark, and he had thought it was the beginning of something. It had not been the beginning of something. It had been the last of something. He checked the sky every morning. This was the first thing he did when he stepped outside. Before he walked to the field, before he spoke to anyone, he stood in the yard and looked at the western horizon, where weather came from in this part of Virginia, and he read the clouds the way a man reads a page he has read many times and is hoping will say something different this time. Most mornings the sky was clear. On the mornings when there were clouds, they were the wrong kind, high and thin and moving fast, the kind that carried no rain and did not pretend to. He had told Eli, toward the end of the second week, that dry spells in August were not unusual in this county. He had told Margaret that the tobacco had come through dry summers before, that the plants were more resilient than they looked, that the color issue on the outer rows was the kind of thing that corrected itself when the weather shifted. He had said these things with the confidence of a man who had been farming for 11 years and knew his land. He had believed them at the time he said them. He had stopped fully believing them somewhere around day 15, but he had continued saying them because the alternative was to stop saying them, and he was not ready for what came after that. Margaret listened to these assessments and said very little in response. She had her own way of tracking the situation. She tracked it through the corn crib, which she opened every few days, and assessed with the same quiet arithmetic she had been running since July. She tracked it through the kitchen garden, which was suffering in the dry heat, in ways that were going to affect what she could put on the table between now and the first frost. She tracked it through the faces of her children at meals, which told her things the ledger above the fireplace could not. On the morning of day 17, she opened the corn crib and stood inside it longer than usual. When she came out, she went directly to the kitchen and adjusted the proportions of that morning's porridge without saying anything to anyone about why. It was a small adjustment, No one at the table noticed. That was the point. Nate had known for 2 weeks. He had not known it the way a man knows something he has been told. He had known it the way a man knows things. He has arrived at through his hands and his feet and the particular attention that comes from working a piece of ground every day in every kind of weather for 6 years. He had felt it in the soil when he pushed the hoe through it, the way the dry earth gave differently than it should have given in late July. He had seen it in the root systems of the plants he pulled when thinning the rows, the way the roots were working harder and finding less. He watched the parts of the field that James inspected from the edge, and what he watched told him 2 weeks ago that this dry spell was going to become something the family would still be talking about in November. He did not say this to James. He had thought about it. He had stood in the field on the morning he was sure of it, and considered what it would mean to walk to where James was working and tell him directly what the soil was saying. He had run through the possible versions of that conversation. He had decided against it, not because it would not help James to know, because there was a way that James needed to arrive at the knowledge himself, at his own pace, in the order that made it possible for him to act on it rather than simply feel it. Nate arriving with the information ahead of schedule would not change the reality of the situation. It would only change who James was frustrated with when the reality became impossible to ignore. So he worked. He checked the leaves. He reported what he found at the end of each day when James asked him, accurately and completely. And he did not add what he had known for 2 weeks, which was that the leaves were going to keep getting worse until the rain came, or until there was nothing left to get worse. Day 19. That evening, James sat at the table with the ledger open in front of him. He had opened it with the intention of writing something, of making some notation that acknowledged the dry spell and adjusted his projections accordingly. He sat with the pen in his hand and looked at the 4 lines of numbers he had written 3 weeks ago. He did not write anything. The fire in the hearth had burned down to coals. Margaret was at her spinning in the corner, the wheel turning with the low, steady sound it always made in the evenings. The children were in their beds. The house was quiet. James looked at the numbers. £800 for Calder, 600 for the levy and the tithe, 600 for winter goods, 400 in reserve. He had written those numbers when he still believed this was going to be the year he got ahead. He looked at them now, and they looked like something written by a man he used to know. He put the pen down. A man who stops writing in his ledger has not stopped counting. He has simply found a number he is not ready to put into words. He closed the book. Outside, the sky was clear and full of stars. The way it was. Every night, it was not going to rain. Eli found the first one on a Thursday morning in the 3rd week of August. He was working the middle rows, checking the undersides of leaves the way Nate had shown him, without either of them making much of a lesson out of it. He turned over a leaf near the top of a plant and found the hornworm on the stem just below the leaf joint. It was green, the color of the plant itself, which was how they survived. It was large enough that he was not sure how he had missed it on the previous check. Then he looked at the plant more carefully and found 2 more on the same stem and understood that he had not missed them before because they had not been there before. He looked at the plant next to it. 2 on that one. He looked at the plant on the other side. He called for his father. James came down the row and looked at what Eli was showing him. He did not say anything for a moment. He looked at the first plant and the second plant, and then moved further down the row and checked 3 more, and came back with his face arranged in the expression he used when he was working out what to do and did not want anyone to see the working out. He told Eli to start at the top of the row and work down, pull every one he found, and kill it. He would take the next row over. They worked through the morning. The tobacco hornworm is a large caterpillar, green-bodied with white markings along its sides, and a curved horn at its rear end that looks more threatening than it is. It eats tobacco leaves, starting at the edges and working inward, left alone. Even a few worms could make a good plant look ruined in a matter of days. Finding them requires checking the underside of every leaf on every plant, one at a time, because the worm is the color of the plant and does not move when disturbed, and can sit on a stem for hours in plain sight without being seen by anyone not looking at exactly the right angle, in exactly the right light. It is not complicated work. It is only slow and hot and repetitive. And it has to be done right, because the ones you miss today are bigger tomorrow. By mid-morning, Margaret had sent Hannah to help, and by noon Nate had joined them. The 4 of them moved through the rows in the August heat, bending over each plant, turning leaves, checking stems, pulling worms and dropping them into a bucket of water. Nobody talked much. There was not a lot to say. The work was the work. In the middle of the afternoon, Eli stopped at a plant near the center of the field and looked at it for a long moment. The plant had been one of the better ones 2 weeks ago, tall and well-leaved and the right color. Several of the upper leaves were gone entirely, eaten down to the stem. The leaves that remained had the ragged edges of something worked on steadily for several days. He picked up a hornworm from the stem. It was the largest one he had found all day. He held it between his fingers and felt the weight of it, which was surprising for something so small. Then he pressed his fingers together, and the worm burst and left a green stain across his palm. He looked at his hand. Then he looked down the row at his father, 3 plants ahead, and bent over a stem and not looking up. He asked, without looking away from his stained hand, "How many leaves make a pound?" James did not answer. He probably had not heard. Eli was not sure he had meant for James to hear. He wiped his hand on his trousers and moved to the next plant and kept working. The worms did not create the bad year. The dry summer had weakened the plants first. Weakened plants drew damage. The worms had simply arrived to confirm what the soil had already decided. They made the bad year impossible to deny. That evening, after the buckets had been emptied and the day's tally recorded, Eli found his mother in the kitchen and told her the number he had worked out during the afternoon. The number of leaves lost in the past week, what that translated to in pounds of finished tobacco at the end of the season if the infestation continued at the same rate. Margaret listened. She did not say the number back to him. She did not write it down. She just listened. And when he was finished, she nodded once. She already knew. He could see from her face that she already knew. She had worked it out herself, probably before he had, and had been carrying it the way she carried most of the numbers that mattered on this farm. It was the first time this summer that he and his mother had held the same true number at the same time without his father being part of the conversation. He was not sure how he felt about that. He went back outside. The light was going and the field was darkening, and the tobacco plants stood in their rows looking the way they always looked at dusk. which was like something that might still be fine if the night went well and the morning came right. He was 16 years old, and he had just spent a full day removing green worms from the undersides of leaves one at a time in the August heat. Tomorrow, he would do it again. And the day after that, until there were no more worms, or no more leaves, or no more summer left for it to matter. That evening the whole family came back from the field with green on their hands. Tobacco resin, the kind that did not wash off quickly. It settled into the lines of the palms and the spaces around the fingernails and stayed there through supper and into the evening. James looked at his own hands in the last light before he went inside. He thought about Calder. He thought about 800 pounds. He thought about the distance between the number in the ledger and the number that was actually out there in the field. Tonight that distance was larger than this morning. The worms had not created the bad year. They had only made it impossible to keep pretending otherwise. Margaret woke before the fire. This was not unusual. She had woken before the fire for most of her adult life. First in her father's house, and then in this one, and the habit had settled into her body so completely that she no longer thought of it as waking early. It was simply the time she woke. The house was dark, and the coals in the hearth had gone gray at the edges, and the sound of James breathing in the other room was steady and slow. She got up and built the fire, and put the water on, and sat down at the kitchen table in the dark with her hands around a cup that was not yet warm. She did this sometimes when she needed to think without anyone watching her think. There was a kind of thinking that went differently when no one was in the room, a kind that required the freedom to arrive at conclusions without managing how the arriving looked to someone else. She did her best thinking alone in the kitchen before the household woke up. This morning, she had a great deal to think about. She started with the flour. The barrel in the corner held enough for approximately 6 weeks of bread at the current rate. She had measured this the previous evening by pressing her arm into the barrel to the depth of the remaining flour and comparing it against the mark she had put on the barrel stave 3 weeks ago. When she had started keeping track, 6 weeks of flour meant 6 weeks of bread, and 6 weeks from now would put them in mid-October, which was before the real cold came, but after the point when the kitchen garden would stop producing anything worth eating. She moved from the flour to the cornmeal. At the current rate of consumption, the family would have cornmeal through late February. That was assuming they did not increase their consumption during the cold months, which they would, because cold months required more food than warm ones. Bodies in winter burned what they ate faster than bodies in summer. And a family doing winter work in a Virginia farmhouse burned through provisions faster than anyone's best planning accounted for. She moved to the salt pork. 1 barrel and a half. The half barrel she had opened in July and was working through now. The full barrel she had not opened yet and was trying not to open before October, because once it was open it would begin to need managing. And managing it would make the contents feel more finite than they already were. Salt was its own concern. She needed salt to preserve any additional meat they managed to put up before winter. That meant either purchasing more from Yorktown or getting it through trade. And purchasing from Yorktown meant Calder's store. And Calder's store meant credit. And credit this year meant a conversation she did not want James to have before the tobacco harvest was in and the damage was fully visible. Candles. Enough through Christmas, if the family used them carefully. She had already started trimming the wicks shorter than usual. No one had said anything about it. Cloth. Not enough to make Eli a proper winter shirt. Enough to patch the one he had, which would get him through if the patches held. His shoulders had grown 3 inches since last winter. Gunpowder. Enough for 3 hunting trips. Maybe 4 if Eli was careful. If the hunting went well, fresh meat from the forest would extend the salt pork into March. If it did not go well, she would need to decide by December whether to butcher one of the animals they had been planning to keep through winter for breeding. That decision affected not just this winter, but next spring and the spring after that. She went through the rest of it the same way. Beans, dried herbs, apple preserves from the previous fall. The half-wheel of hard cheese she was rationing to 1 meal a week because there would not be another until next year's milk came in. When she was finished, she sat with the empty cup in her hands. She was not a woman given to panic. Panic was a thing that happened when a person ran out of options. And she had not yet run out of options. She had options. Several of them were bad options, and some were worse than others. But they were options. And as long as she had them, she was not going to spend energy on panic that she could spend on something more useful. What she was clear. She knew what the family had. She knew what the family needed. She knew the distance between those two things and the rate at which that distance was changing. James still believed the crisis lived in the field. She understood why. The field was where he could see it, and he was a man who worked best on things he could see. But the crisis had moved. It had left the field sometime around the 2nd week of the dry spell and taken up residence in the kitchen. In the corn crib, in the barrel of salt pork she was trying not to open yet. In the flour barrel, with its mark on the stave. That was where the crisis lived now. She had not told him this. She had thought about how to tell him and had not found a version that helped him act rather than worry. And worrying without acting was the thing that did the most damage to a man like James. So she had continued to make the adjustments that needed to be made. Quietly, 1 meal at a time, in ways that no one at the table noticed. The morning porridge had been thinner by 2 spoonfuls of meal since the middle of July. The bread was a quarter smaller than it had been in June. The midday meal had lost one of its 2 components. She had simply made the remaining component slightly larger and not mentioned the one that was gone. Hannah had not noticed. Eli had noticed, but had not said anything. She knew this because she had seen him pause over his plate once in the 3rd week of July. A brief hesitation before he picked up his spoon. The hesitation of someone registering a difference. They are deciding not to name. He had picked up his spoon and eaten without speaking, and she had felt something in her chest. She did not have a precise word for something between pride and sorrow. James had not noticed. The fire had caught and was burning steadily now, and the water was beginning to move in the pot. She could hear James turning in the other room. Hannah would be up in a few minutes. She got up and measured the cornmeal for the morning porridge. She measured it the way she had been measuring it for weeks. Carefully, precisely, without making any expression that would tell anyone watching her what the measuring meant. That evening James came in from the field and sat at the table and said they would manage. She said yes. She put the pot on the table. She said yes, because it was what the moment required, and because James needed to believe it was possible before he could make it possible. The longer version of her answer involved flour barrels and cornmeal and salt and a sealed barrel in the larder she was trying not to open before October. It arrived at a conclusion that was not quite the same as what James meant when he said they would manage. But it was close enough that she was willing to let the word cover the distance between them for one more night. She served the meal. She served herself last, as she always did. James still believed the crisis lived in the field. Margaret knew it had already moved into the kitchen. From this morning forward, every meal was a calculation. She had always known it would come to this. She had simply not known which morning it would start. Hunger did not make the household equal. It revealed the order that had already been there. The supper table held 5 places. It had held 5 places for 6 years. Since Hannah was old enough to sit at the table rather than on Margaret's lap, and the arrangement had not changed in all that time. James at the head, where the light from the fire reached best. Margaret at the opposite end, closest to the hearth and the pot. Eli on the left bench, Hannah on the right, nearer the window. 5 places. Nate ate outside. This was not a decision that had been made out loud. It was simply the way things were. The way they had been from the first week Nate arrived on this farm. And in the years since then, it had settled into the structure of the household so completely that no one thought of it as a decision anymore. Margaret brought his portion to him in the evening, carried across the yard to where he sat near the small building at the back of the property. She set it down. He received it. That was the end of the exchange. Most evenings, in a good year, the portions were not something anyone paid close attention to. In a good year, the pot was full, and the table held enough, and the question of how much each person received was not a question anyone needed to sit with for very long. James ate enough to maintain the strength he needed for the work. That was logic, not selfishness, and everyone at the table understood it. Eli ate nearly as much. Margaret ate less than either of them, as she always had, not by instruction, but by the habit of a woman who served others before herself, and ate what remained. Hannah ate what a 13-year-old girl ate, which was less than the men and more than Margaret. In a good year, this was not complicated. This was not a good year. The pot was not empty. Margaret had not let it come to that. And she was not going to let it come to that if she had any way to prevent it. But the pot was holding less than it had been holding in June, and the people sitting down to it were the same 5 bodies doing the same work in the same heat. And the difference between what the pot held and what those bodies needed was a gap that Margaret was managing, 1 meal at a time. Nate's portion had changed. It had changed 3 weeks ago, and the change had not been announced and had not been discussed and had not been made into a decision that anyone acknowledged making. The bowl that went across the yard each evening was not dramatically different from the bowl that had gone across the yard in June. It was smaller in the way that things got smaller when someone paying close attention made them smaller carefully enough that no one else noticed. Nate noticed. He noticed on the second evening, when the difference was large enough to be felt. He sat with the bowl and understood what it was telling him, which was not a surprise to him, not in any deep sense, because he had understood before anyone at the table said anything that this was the kind of year where adjustments would be made, and that the adjustments would not be made evenly. He did not say anything. There was no one to say anything to, and nothing to say that would change the size of the bowl. And the energy required to say it was energy he was going to need for other things. No one announced that his portion had changed. That was part of it. A thing could become smaller without ever becoming a decision anyone admitted making. The bowl went across the yard. He received it. The transaction completed itself in silence, the way it always had. Hannah watched her mother carry the bowl across the yard one evening in the third week of August. She watched from the doorway, where she had stopped on her way to empty the washing water, and she stood there for a moment with the bucket in her hand. She had seen this happen hundreds of times. It was one of the ordinary events of her life on this farm. As ordinary as the fire in the morning and the water from the well. She had never paid it particular attention before. She paid it attention now. She was 13 years old, and she was beginning to understand things she did not yet have language for. Understanding them through the accumulation of small observations that each meant very little alone and meant a great deal together. She had watched the porridge get thinner. She had seen her mother's plate at the end of meals. She had felt the change in the bread without being able to name what had changed. And now she stood in the doorway with the bucket and watched her mother carry a bowl across the yard. She understood, without having the words to say it to anyone, that hunger did not arrive the same way for everyone in a household. She understood that it arrived in an order. She had not known, before this summer, that there was an order. She was beginning to learn it now, one observation at a time, in the way that children learned the things adults did not sit down to teach them. She went and emptied the washing water. She came back inside. She did not say anything to anyone about what she had understood. After supper, James sat by the fire and Margaret sat across from him with her knitting. The same arrangement they had sat in for years on evenings when the work was done and the children had gone to their beds. The fire was lower than it would have been in June. The candle on the table between them had been trimmed shorter. James looked at the fire. Margaret's needles moved. The room held all of it. The things that had been said, and the things that had not been said, and the things that both of them knew, and neither of them was saying. The fire burned lower. Outside, the river moved. Inside, everyone had eaten the amount they were allowed to eat. No one said anything about what that meant. The boat appeared on the river on a Wednesday morning in late September. James saw it from the upper field and recognized the shape of it before it was close enough to see clearly. Because he had been watching for it since the beginning of the month and had developed the particular alertness of a man waiting for something he cannot stop from coming. He stood at the edge of the upper field and watched the boat work its way up the tributary against the current. 2 men at the oars and a third figure seated at the stern. He did not need to see the face to know whose face it was. He set down what he was carrying and went to the house to tell Margaret that Calder was coming. She said she would put water on. He went back outside and waited at the edge of the yard. Robert Calder was 45 years old and had been a merchant and factor in Yorktown for the better part of 2 decades. Long enough that he had developed the particular manner of a man who had sat across a table from a great many Virginia farmers in a great many difficult seasons, and had learned that patience was its own form of pressure. He was not a cruel man. He arrived at the yard with the pleasant expression of someone paying a social call, shook James's hand with a firm grip, asked after Margaret and the children, and accepted the offer of tea with what appeared to be genuine appreciation. He sat down at the table and looked around the house the way he always looked around the houses he visited on these calls, taking in the room with the mild interest of a man who found people and their households genuinely interesting. Margaret brought the tea and went back to the kitchen. Calder wrapped both hands around the cup. He said it had been a hard summer across the county. He said he had come from 3 farms before this one, all of them dealing with variations of the same situation. The dry spell, and then the insects, and then the weight of both things together on crops that had started the season with some promise. He said this without any particular inflection, the way a man reports weather. James said it had been a difficult season. Yes, Calder nodded. He drank his tea. He set the cup down. Then he reached into his coat and produced a small bound book and set it on the table between them. The book was dark-covered and worn at the corners from handling, and James had seen it before, had seen it at this table twice in the years of their arrangement, and the sight of it did what it always did, which was to make the room feel slightly smaller than it had felt before. Calder opened it to a page near the middle and turned it so James could read what was written there. James's name was at the top of the page. Below it were the terms of the debt from the year before. The £800 he had taken on when he purchased the Eastern Acres. And below that were the figures for the goods he had received on credit in the spring of this year, listed individually in Calder's careful hand. Salt, 2 large measures, cloth, 3 boats, 1 linen, 2 wool, iron nails, 1 quantity, assorted, gunpowder, 1 horn, thread, several spools. Each item had a figure beside it. At the bottom of the column, those figures were added into a total, and beside the total was the interest that had accumulated on the original debt since the previous November. Below that was a line combining everything into a single number. James looked at that number. Calder did not rush him. This was something James had noticed about Calder in all the years of their arrangement. The man was never in a hurry during these conversations. He sat with the patience of someone who understood that a silence allowed to go on long enough eventually required the other person to fill it, and that what people said when they filled silences told you more than what they said when they had prepared themselves to speak. James looked at the number. He told Calder that the season had not produced what he had planned for. Calder said he understood. He said it was the same story across the county, and that he had communicated as much to his contacts in London, and that there was a degree of understanding on that end of the arrangement for seasons that fell outside a farmer's control. James said he could cover a portion of the debt with the current harvest. He named a figure. Calder listened. He wrote something in his book. He looked at what he had written, then looked back at James, with the expression of a man doing arithmetic he had already done before arriving, and was now doing again for the sake of form. He said he could work with that. He would carry the remainder forward to the following season, with the appropriate adjustment for the additional time. Then he said, "I can wait." James. London may not. He said it without any particular weight, the way a man states a fact about geography. London was across the ocean. London operated on its own schedule. The men in London, who were owed portions of what Calder owed, did not know James Whitfield's name, and did not need to, because their relationship was not with James Whitfield, but with the ledger page that had James Whitfield's name on it. A ledger page did not have a difficult summer, or a dry spell, or hornworm damage. A ledger page had only numbers, and the numbers were either satisfied or they were not. Calder closed his book. He finished his tea. He asked how the Eastern Acres were looking. The parcel James had purchased 2 years before. He asked it as a man asks about land he has seen and found interesting. with the mild curiosity of someone who appreciates good property. James said the land was fine. Calder nodded. He said land along the tributary was holding its value well. He said he had been involved recently in the transfer of a similar parcel 2 miles downstream, and that the price had been better than anyone had expected given the general difficulties of the season. Virginia land was a reliable thing. In his experience, it was there when the crops were not, and people who needed it knew where to find it. He stood and shook James's hand again, and said he would come back in November to settle the remainder of the current season's accounting. He went back down to the boat. James stood at the edge of the yard and watched the boat work its way back downstream, back toward Yorktown, back toward the larger water and the route to places he would never see. He stood there until the boat disappeared around the first bend of the tributary. He knew what Calder's last words about the land had meant. He had known before Calder finished saying them. The river carried Calder away. It would carry him back in November. The debt stayed. September came, and the tobacco came down. This was the part that did not change. The part that the summer and the dry spell and the hornworm damage could delay, but could not cancel. Because the plants had grown as far as they were going to grow, and the season was ending, whether James was ready for it to end or not. He rose before light on the first morning of the harvest and went to the field and began cutting. And Eli was beside him before the sun cleared the eastern tree line. And Nate was already at the far end of the rows. Having started earlier than either of them, they cut the plants at the base with the long-handled tobacco knife. A sweeping motion that James had made so many times, his body performed it without instruction from his mind. He caught each plant and slid it onto the wooden spear he carried, threading the stalk through so the plant hung inverted. When the spear was full, he carried it to the barn and hung it on the curing tier and came back for another. The work was the same as it had been every September for 11 years. The plants were not the same. He knew it before he started counting. He could feel it in the weight of each spear as he carried it, in the fullness of the hanging plants, in the way the barn filled more slowly than it should have for the number of rows they were cutting. The leaves were smaller than last year. Several of the upper plants were missing their top leaves entirely, stripped by the hornworms in August and not replaced. The lower leaves on many plants had the yellowed edges that came from a summer of not enough water at the wrong times. He hung each plant without stopping. He did not say anything to Eli. He did not say anything to Nate. The curing took 3 weeks. James checked the barn every morning and every evening, adjusting the vents, monitoring the fire that ran through the nights to bring the temperature up and start the color change in the leaves. This was the work he was best at. The precise work. The work that required the kind of judgment that could not be written down anywhere and was learned only by doing it badly first. He was good at this. He had always been good at this. And whatever the plants had been through this summer, they were going to be cured as well as any plants he had ever cured. Because the curing was still in his control, even when nothing else was. Nate sat watch on the nights when the fire needed tending through the dark hours. He had always done this. He sat in the barn doorway and kept the fire at the temperature it needed to be, adding wood at the intervals. The process required reading the heat of the air inside the barn with the same attention he gave to the field during the growing season. James slept on those nights, or tried to. In the 4th week of September, when the curing was finished, and the leaves had come to the color that indicated they were ready. He and Eli stripped them from the stems and graded them and packed them into the hogsheads, the large barrels that would carry the crop to market. They worked through 2 full days doing this, and James counted what went into each barrel. And when the last barrel was sealed, he stood in the barn and did the arithmetic he had been putting off since July. He went inside and sat at the table with the ledger. He opened it to the page where he had written the 4 lines in July, and he wrote the number that was in his head, 1,050 pounds. He looked at it for a long time. Then he picked up his pen and drew a line through each of the 4 lines he had written in July, not to erase them, to mark them as things written by a man who had stood at the edge of a field in July and believed that the summer ahead of him was going to be the one that finally got him ahead. 800 pounds for Calder, a line through it. 600 for the levy and the tithe, a line through it. 600 for winter goods, a line through it. 400 in reserve, a line through it. He set the pen down. 1,050 pounds on one side, 2,400 on the other, until the harvest. James had been fighting a possibility. After the harvest, he was fighting arithmetic. He sat with that for a long time. Margaret came in from the kitchen and looked at him and looked at the ledger and looked at him again. She did not ask him what he had written. She could see from his face what he had written. She had known what he was going to write before he wrote it, had known it since the day in July when she had stood in the corn crib and done her own counting. She had been living with that knowledge for 2 months. James had been living with it for approximately 10 minutes, and his face showed it. She went back to the kitchen without saying anything. He needed to sit with the number before he could talk about it, and talking about it before he was ready would only produce a conversation that neither of them could finish. She put water on, in the barn, through the wall of the house, and through the dark of the September evening. Nate was banking the fire that had burned through the curing season, spreading the coals and damping them for the last time. The leaves were down. The hogsheads were sealed. The fire had done what it was supposed to do and was finished. He sat back on his heels and looked at the banked coals for a moment. He had counted the weight of the hogsheads as they were being packed. He knew what was in those barrels. He had known before James knew. He had known since the first week of August, when the leaves started telling him what they were going to amount to, and he had carried the number since then, the way he carried most of what he knew on this farm, quietly, in the part of himself that he kept separate from the parts that other people had access to. The crop was in. The year was not over. That was the worst part. The Sunday after the harvest, James put on his good coat. It was the coat he wore to services and to county meetings, a dark wool coat that Margaret brushed and hung carefully after each wearing. He had worn it for 7 years. It still fit well enough. Margaret had let out the seams twice in those years without mentioning it, and James had not mentioned it either. He put it on and went outside to where Margaret and the children were waiting. They walked to services the way they always walked, as a family, along the path that ran from their property, through the stand of oak and hickory to the church road, and then down the road to the parish church, a distance of something under 2 miles. Hannah walked beside Margaret. Eli walked a few steps behind his father. In the position he had occupied on this walk for as long as James could remember, the morning was cool and clear, the first real coolness of the season. and the light through the oaks was the particular gold light of October in Virginia that arrived every year on its own schedule. Indifferent to what the people living under it were managing, the church was already half full when they arrived. James took his family to their usual place and sat down, and the service proceeded the way it always proceeded. He stood when it was time to stand and sat when it was time to sit, and said the responses at the appropriate moments. None of this required his full attention, which meant his full attention was elsewhere. He was aware of the other families. He had always been aware of them in a general way. The awareness that comes from living in a small community, where the same people occupy the same spaces week after week. But this morning he was aware of them in a different way, a more specific way. The way you are aware of people when you suspect they are looking at you, and you are trying not to confirm the suspicion by looking back. After the service, the congregation moved outside into the October morning in the unhurried way of people who have nowhere specific to be and are glad to stand in pleasant weather and talk. James stood with Margaret near the edge of the gathering and accepted the greetings that came his way and returned them in kind. A man named Fletcher, whose farm was a mile east along the county road, came and stood beside him. Fletcher said it had been a hard summer for everyone in the county, which was true. He said these things ran in cycles. His own father had told him more than once that a bad year was not a judgment, but a weather event, and that the land would come back. James said he appreciated that. While Fletcher was talking, his eyes moved to Eli's coat. It was a brief movement, less than a second, probably not even intentional. Eli's coat was the one he had worn to services all of last year, and it was too short in the arms now by an inch and a half. Fletcher's eyes registered this and came back to James's face, and he smiled and said, well, God willing, next year would be kinder, and moved on. James watched him go. There was nothing malicious in what Fletcher had done, but James had seen it and understood what it meant. The community had registered something, and what the community registered it remembered, and what it remembered it carried into every subsequent conversation about land and credit and the reliability of the family next door. That was what Fletcher's glance had done in less than a second. Reverend Aldous appeared at his elbow some time later. Aldous was a man of 55 or so, with the careful manner of someone who had spent decades learning to ask questions in ways that did not feel like questions. He shook James's hand and asked how the family was keeping. And James said, well, thank you. And Aldous nodded and asked how the season had come out. And James said it had been a difficult one. The dry spell, and then the insects. Aldous said he had heard much the same from several families in the parish. He let that sit for a moment. Then he said that the vestry was aware of the pressures this kind of season placed on families in the parish, and that there were mechanisms available for situations where those pressures became difficult to manage alone. He said this gently, without any implication that he was describing James's situation in particular. He was simply noting the existence of a thing, the way a man notes the existence of a tool, without insisting that anyone pick it up. James said he appreciated Aldous saying so. Aldous nodded and said to give his regards to Margaret. And he moved on. James stood where he was for a moment. The knowledge of his trouble was no longer entirely his to carry alone. It had crossed whatever boundary had previously contained it. Fletcher's eyes on Eli's coat, Aldous's mention of the vestry, without mentioning his name, These were the signs of a thing that had moved from the field and the kitchen into the space between him and the people around him. Margaret appeared beside him. She said Hannah was ready to go home if he was. He said he was ready. They gathered the children and walked back the way they had come. Through the gold October light, under the oaks, James walked the familiar path and said nothing, and thought about what Aldous had said and what Fletcher's eyes had done. By Monday morning, James still owned his farm, but he no longer owned the knowledge of his trouble. That had become a thing other people held now. And what people held, they eventually used, in one way or another, whether they intended to or not. He went back to work. James and Eli loaded the hogsheads onto the flat-bottomed boat on a gray morning in early October. There were 2 of them, 2 barrels, which was 1 fewer than James had loaded in the same spot 2 years before, and 2 fewer than the year he had bought the eastern acres. Each hogshead held roughly 1,000 pounds of cured tobacco leaf, packed tight and sealed, and together they represented everything the field had produced that season. Everything the summer of dry heat and hornworm damage and wrong-colored leaves had left him with after 3 weeks of curing in the barn. 1,050 pounds, distributed between 2 barrels that were not quite full. He and Eli worked in silence, rolling the barrels down the bank and onto the boat. The tributary was running low, lower than usual, even for October. Another residue of the summer that had not yet fully resolved itself. And the boat sat higher in the water than it would have with a full load. They pushed off from the bank, and Eli took the oars, and James sat in the forward position and watched the farm recede behind them as the current took them downstream. The river was not a backdrop. It was the reason Yorktown was where it was. The reason Calder's store was where it was. The reason James had bought this particular piece of ground 11 years ago and not a piece of ground 10 miles to the west. Everything moved through the water. Tobacco out, goods in, credit in one direction, debt in the other. The tributary was the farm's connection to every system it could not see. And every system it could not see had a claim on what the tributary carried. Calder was at the landing when they arrived. He helped them unload the hogsheads without being asked. He was good at this, at the physical helpfulness that put a man at ease in a situation where ease did not come naturally. When the hogsheads were on the dock, he opened one and looked at the tobacco inside and handled a portion of it and said it was well cured, which it was. And James accepted this without pleasure, because well-cured tobacco at half the needed volume was a compliment that did not address the problem. Calder produced his book. The price James received for his tobacco was set by men who had never seen his field. They had not watched the hornworms work through the upper leaves in August. They had not counted the days without rain. They set the price based on what the market across the ocean needed that season. And what the market across the ocean needed that season had nothing to do with what James Whitfield needed in Virginia. The 2 numbers had never been designed to match. That was not a flaw in the system. That was the system. Calder showed James the number. He did not need to explain what the number meant. James looked at it and did the multiplication in his head. 1,050 pounds at this price. The result was what it was. It was less than the 800 pounds he owed from the previous year's debt, expressed in currency equivalent, which meant that the entire harvest, everything the summer had produced was not sufficient to retire the oldest portion of what he owed. Without touching the levy, without touching the winter goods account, James said nothing for a long moment. Calder recorded what he had received, and credited what he could credit, and noted the remainder in his book, and said he would be in touch about the November settlement. James said yes. He and Eli pushed the empty boat back into the current and started home. The river ran the same direction it always ran, which was away from where they were going. Eli pulled against it with the steady rhythm of a young man who had learned to row on this water. James sat in the front of the boat and watched the banks go past and thought about the number Calder had shown him and what the number meant for the conversation he was going to have with Margaret when he got home. The farm came back into view around the last bend. The barn roof first, and then the house, and then the field. James looked at it the way he always looked at it when he came back to it from the water, with the particular feeling of a man who has left a place and returned to it and found it the same. This evening the feeling was more complicated than it usually was. He stepped off the boat onto the bank and helped Eli pull it up, and they walked to the house through the October evening. The light was going gold in the tree line to the west. The river kept moving behind them. The river had carried his tobacco away. It had not carried his debt with it. Pride is expensive in November. Calder came back on the 4th of November. James had known he would come on or around that date because Calder had said November. And Calder was a man who meant what he said about dates, in the way that men who deal in credit and obligation tend to be precise about time, because time is the medium in which interest accumulates, and vagueness about time is a form of imprecision that costs money. James had spent the weeks between October and November doing the arithmetic he had been avoiding since September, running the numbers in the evenings after the children were in bed, writing things in the ledger, and crossing them out and writing them again in different configurations, trying to find an arrangement of what he had and what he owed that produced something other than the conclusion he kept arriving at. He had not found one. The morning Calder's boat appeared on the tributary James was splitting wood in the yard, the work he did in November to build the winter supply. He put the axe down and stood for a moment, watching the boat come up through the gray morning water. His breath made small clouds in front of him that disappeared as fast as they formed. He picked up his coat from the fence post where he had hung it and put it on and went to meet the boat at the bank. Calder came up from the water with his book under his arm and shook James's hand and said it was a cold one this morning. James said it was. They walked up to the house together, in the manner of two men who have an understood purpose and do not need to describe it to each other. Margaret had the fire going and water already on when they came through the door. She had seen the boat from the window and made the preparations that the situation called for. Then she removed herself to the kitchen, because these conversations went better when she was present enough to hear what was said, but absent enough that the men could say it without an audience. James and Calder sat at the table. Calder opened his book to James's page and set it between them. James had seen most of these numbers before. He had been living with them in his head for months. But there was something about seeing them written in someone else's hand, in a book that would go back to Yorktown when this was over, that made them more fixed than they had felt in his own ledger. Calder walked through the accounting with patient thoroughness. The original debt from the Eastern Acres purchase, the interest on that debt through the current date, the spring goods credit, listed individually, interest on that credit, the credit from the October crop delivery, subtracted from the total, What remained after the October credit was applied was more than half of what he had originally owed, not counting the levy and the tithe, which were their own obligation, and did not appear in Calder's book. Calder said he was prepared to carry the remainder forward to the following season. He said the arrangement would require a small additional adjustment for the extended period. James said he understood. There was a silence. Calder let it go on for a moment. And then he said there was another possibility he wanted to put forward, if James was willing to consider it. He said it not as a threat and not as a suggestion that carried urgency, but in the way a man mentions an option he has thought about in advance and believes to be reasonable. He said that the 20 acres along the eastern edge of the property, the parcel along the tributary, represented value that was not being fully realized in the current arrangement. He said the land along this stretch of the tributary was holding its value well and in some cases increasing. There were buyers who had expressed interest in parcels of this type. If James were willing to consider a transfer of that parcel, the proceeds could be applied against the outstanding balance in a way that would substantially improve his position going into the next season. He said it was simply an option. James looked at the book. He thought about the Eastern Acres. He had purchased them 2 years ago because they were the parcel that would allow him to expand his tobacco production to a scale where the numbers finally worked. He had believed this when he bought them. He had believed it right up until July of this year, when the field had started telling him a different story. He told Calder he would need to think about it overnight. Calder said, "Of course." He finished his tea and put his book away and said he would come back in the morning. Then he went back down to the boat, and James stood at the edge of the yard and watched him go, and then went inside. Margaret was at the kitchen table when he came through. She had heard the conversation. She had heard all of it through the not quite solid wall between the kitchen and the main room, and she was sitting with her hands around a cup that had gone cold while she listened. She looked at him when he came in with the look she had when she had already processed something and was waiting for him to catch up. He sat down across from her. He told her what Calder had proposed. He told her the numbers. He told her what selling the Eastern Acres would do to the balance and what it would mean for the following season's capacity, which was that they would be farming less land with less potential for the kind of yield that had been the whole point of buying the acres in the first place. He laid it out the way he laid things out when he needed to hear them said aloud to understand them properly. Margaret listened. When he was finished, she sat for a moment, looking at her hands on the cup. Then she asked, "Can we live without it?" He said, "This year." "Yes." She said, "Then this year is the year we are in." She said it quietly and without drama, in the voice she used for things that were true and did not need to be made larger than they were. He looked at her, and she looked back at him, and there was a moment between them that required no words, because the words had already been said, and what remained was just the two of them sitting in the kitchen in November, with the fire going, and the decision already made by the time she had asked the question. He said he would tell Calder yes in the morning. She nodded. She got up and put the kettle back on. In the morning, Calder came back, and James told him he would agree to the transfer of the Eastern Acres. Calder produced a document that James read carefully and then signed, and Calder signed below his name and blotted the ink and put the document in his book and stood and shook James's hand. He said it was the right decision for the situation. James said thank you. He walked Calder back to the boat and watched him push off from the bank and disappear around the first bend of the tributary. Then he walked back up to the house, and past the house, and up to the eastern edge of the property, the part that was no longer his property. And he stood at the boundary and looked at the land. It was good land. It was land with access to water, and that meant it was land with value. The kind of value that outlasted bad seasons and difficult years, because the water did not care what kind of year it was. He had known this when he bought it. He had bought it because he knew it. He stood there for a while. The trees along the tributary had gone to their November colors, brown and rust and the last of the yellow, and the water was visible through them running in its direction, toward Yorktown. The same direction it always ran. He had saved the farm by making it smaller. Winter does not care how much land a man used to own. He walked back to the house and picked up the axe from where he had left it by the woodpile that morning, before Calder had come, and the day had become something different from what he had expected. He started splitting wood. Eli and Nate left before first light. This was Eli's idea. The proposal that they take 2 days before the deep cold settled in and go into the timber on the north side of the property and into the larger forest beyond it and see what was there. His father had game to find before January, and the farm's supply of salt pork would not last without supplementing. And Eli was 16 and had been hunting these woods since he was 12 and understood them well enough to be useful in them. What he had not fully understood until they were an hour into the timber, moving through the gray pre-dawn dark, with their breath coming out in small clouds and the frozen leaves cracking under their feet, was how different the forest was, at this temperature, from the forest in the fall seasons he had hunted before. Everything had gone quiet in the way things go quiet, when the cold has settled into the ground and the animals have adjusted to it, moving less and feeding in shorter windows and being more careful about where they moved and when. The deer that had been visible at the edges of the fields through October were deeper in the timber now. The tracks Eli was following were older than they looked because the cold had slowed the process, and a track made yesterday could look like a track made this morning. He made a wrong turn an hour in. He followed a set of tracks that turned out to be older than he had judged and led them a half-mile northeast before they ended at a stream crossing that had been used at least 2 days prior. He stood at the crossing and looked at the empty bank on the other side and understood that he had lost a half-mile of the morning chasing sign that was not worth chasing. He looked at Nate. Nate was looking at the stream bank, the way he looked at things in the field, which was steadily and without apparent hurry. He crouched and looked at the mud at the edge of the water, and then at the ground to the left of where they were standing, and then at the canopy above them. Then he stood up and turned 45 degrees from the direction Eli had been planning to go and said they should try that way. He did not explain why. Eli followed him. They moved through the timber for another hour in the direction Nate had chosen. The light was coming up by then, the gray December light that arrived slowly, and without the warmth that light in other seasons carried with it. The forest was a different thing in this light. The absence of leaves meant you could see further in every direction, which should have made it easier to find what you were looking for, and would have, except that what you could see further in every direction was more empty forest. They did not speak much. The work of moving through cold timber required attention, and attention did not leave much room for conversation. And they had been working alongside each other long enough that the silence between them was not uncomfortable. Nate stopped at the edge of a small clearing. He stood very still, and Eli stopped behind him and stood still too, because he had learned in the years of working beside this man That stillness on his part usually meant he had noticed something worth waiting for. Nate looked at a mark on the bark of a beech tree at the far edge of the clearing. He looked at it for a moment, then at the ground below it, then at the ground in the center of the clearing where the frost on the leaves had been disturbed. He said there, 2 hours later, they had a small doe and 2 rabbits. And they were moving back through the timber toward the farm with the weight of the doe across Nate's shoulders. And the day had gone from gray to the pale thin blue of a December afternoon, and the cold was deeper now. Eli was behind Nate, carrying the rabbits and the guns, and he was thinking about the clearing and the mark on the beech tree, and the way Nate had read all of it in less time than Eli would have needed to see any one part of it. He had been working alongside Nate for 6 years, or alongside him in the way that the farm permitted. He knew what Nate could do in the tobacco rows. He knew how he moved through the field, and what he could read in a plant that others missed. He had understood, in a general way, for several years, that Nate knew things about this land that his father did not know, and that Nate had arrived at this knowledge the same way anyone arrived at knowledge, which was by paying attention over time. What he had not understood, until this December morning in the timber, was how much of what Nate knew existed entirely outside of any conversation Eli had ever been part of. He asked, walking behind him through the cold trees, "How long have you known this forest?" Nate walked for a few steps before he answered. He said, "Long enough." They walked on. The timber thinned, and the farm came into view ahead of them. The barn roof, and then the house. And Eli could see smoke from the chimney. The sight of it did what the sight of a lit house always did when you were cold, which was to make you aware of exactly how cold you were. He said, without thinking about it much before he said it, "Do you remember where you came from?" Nate walked 2 more steps and then stopped. He stood with the doe across his shoulders and looked at the farm ahead of them for a moment. Then he turned slightly and looked at Eli. Not all the way. Just enough that Eli could see his face in profile into the pale December light. He said, "Remembering is not the same as being allowed to go." He turned back and walked the rest of the way to the farm without saying anything else. Eli followed him. He carried what Nate had said the rest of the way home, and through the handing over of the game to Margaret, and through the rest of the afternoon, the way you carry something that you do not have the right place for yet, that you cannot put down because you have not found where it belongs. Margaret took the game without ceremony. She looked at what they had brought and calculated what it meant in terms of the weeks ahead. And she thanked them and took it inside. Nate waited in the yard for his portion of the day's work to be acknowledged. Then he went to his building at the back of the property. Eli stood in the yard for a moment in the December cold. He thought about the sentence. He thought about what it meant to remember a place you were not allowed to go. To carry the knowledge of somewhere in your body for years, while the body itself was required to stay somewhere else. He thought about how long Nate had been carrying that, and whether it weighed more or less than the doe had weighed on the walk home. He did not know. He was 16 years old, and he had just understood something he did not have the language to explain to anyone. And the not having language for it was part of what made it true. He went inside. The fire was warm, and the house was full of the smell of the rabbits going into the pot. And Hannah was at the table doing her evening work, and his mother was at the fire, managing what needed managing. Eli sat down and held his cold hands near the heat and thought about a sentence that was still inside him and that he suspected was going to stay there for a long time. The seed corn was not food. It was the future disguised as food, and mistaking the future for food was the kind of error you only got to make once. Hannah got sick on the 3rd day of January. It started the way sickness started in winter, with a cough in the night that Margaret heard through the wall and lay awake listening to, measuring it the way she measured everything, assessing its depth and whether it was moving toward something or away from something. By morning, it had moved toward something. The girl was feverish and her chest was tight, and she needed to stay in bed, which meant the fire in the main room needed to burn higher and longer than Margaret had been running it since November. She built the fire up without comment. She knew what it would cost in wood, and in the time it took to cut wood, and in the food the people cutting wood would need to eat to have the energy to cut it. She made the adjustment the way she made all adjustments, without announcing the calculation behind it. Hannah stayed in bed for 3 weeks. She was not dangerously ill, but she was ill enough that the fever came and went for 12 days before it finally stayed gone. And in those 12 days, the household arranged itself around her, the way households arrange themselves around a sick child. James brought extra wood. Eli reduced his own consumption at meals without being asked. Margaret made broths from the bones of the rabbits they had hunted in December and gave Hannah the best of what was in the pot until the girl's color came back and she started asking for more. The asking for more was when Margaret knew she was going to be all right. The sickness had cost them more than they could afford for it to cost them. Not in any single large way. In the accumulated small ways that a household on the edge of its margins felt things. The extra wood moving the supply closer to the point where Eli would need to go back into the forest. The extra food moving the cornmeal supply forward by 2 weeks on the calendar. The disruption to the work schedule, leaving several things undone that needed doing before the deep cold, made them impossible. On a morning in late January, after Hannah had been out of bed for 5 days and was back to her normal self, Margaret rose before the fire as she always did and went outside. The morning was the coldest of the winter so far. The ground was frozen solid under her feet, and the air had the particular bite of a temperature that had gone below what Virginia usually produced. She crossed the yard with her coat pulled close and went to the corn crib and lifted the latch and opened the door. She stood inside. She had not been in the corn crib for 2 weeks. She had known before she opened the door what she was going to find, because she had been tracking the numbers in her head with the same precision she tracked all numbers, and the numbers had been telling her for a week that this visit was going to produce information she was not going to want to carry. The corn crib held what it held. She looked at it for a long time. At the current rate of consumption, the corn would be gone by the middle of March. Planting season did not begin until late April. And even if everything went perfectly from the first day of planting forward, the earliest they could expect corn from the new crop was July. That was a gap of 4 months between when the corn ran out and when new corn came in. They had food for approximately 6 weeks. She looked at the far corner of the crib. In the far corner, separated from the eating corn by a wooden divider, James had built the previous spring, was a cloth bag tied at the top with a piece of cord. The bag held the seed corn for the coming season, enough seed to plant 5 acres, which was the acreage James had committed to corn in the field plan he had worked out in December. The plan that was supposed to be the beginning of the recovery. The seed corn was not food. It was the future, disguised as food. And mistaking the future for food was the kind of error you only got to make once. She looked at the bag for a long moment. Then she went back to the house and put the water on and waited for James. He came out of the bedroom when the light was still gray, dressed and ready the way he always was in winter. Because lying in bed, once he was awake, was something his body did not permit. He sat down at the table, and she put a cup in front of him, and she sat across from him and told him what she had found in the corn crib. She told him the numbers, the current supply, the rate of consumption, the date the supply would run out. She laid it out without interpretation, without the emotional weight she was actually carrying it with. Because if she put the emotional weight in the telling, he would respond to the emotion rather than the information. She told him the gap was somewhere between 6 and 7 weeks. He sat with his cup and looked at the table. She watched him work through it. She could see it happening in his face, the arithmetic moving through him the way it always moved through him, steadily, without shortcuts. She waited while it moved. He said they could reduce the rations further. She said they already had. He said he could go into the forest more often. Eli could go. They could supplement with game through February and into March. She said yes. They could, and they would, and it would help. But it would not close the gap by itself. He said nothing for a moment. Then he said the seed corn. She said yes. He looked up at her. The seed corn was next year. Without it, there was no corn crop in the coming year, which meant no food reserve in the following winter, which meant they would arrive at this same conversation 12 months from now, with nothing in the far corner of the crib to even consider. But the seed corn was also corn, and they needed corn now. He said, "We cannot touch it." She said, "I know." She said it without arguing, because she was not arguing. She had not brought this to him to advocate for touching the seed corn. She had brought it to him because she could not solve the gap by herself, and she had run out of adjustments she could make alone, and this was a problem that required 2 people, and she was not willing to be the only one who knew about it anymore. He sat for a long time. Outside, the January cold pressed against the walls of the house, finding the gaps in the boards that were invisible in summer and very much present in winter. And the fire in the hearth was doing its work, but the room was not warm in the way it had been warm in September, before the firewood supply started to matter. Then he said there was the Birch family. Thomas Birch had corn, or had had corn going into winter. They had spoken at services in November, and Birch had mentioned a better season than most. She said yes. The Birch family was an option. She did not say what came with that option. She let it sit between them, the way things sat between them when both of them already knew what the thing was. Thomas Birch had a son who was 17. Thomas Birch had been pleasant to James at services in a way that was slightly more pleasant than ordinary neighborliness. Borrowing corn from the Birch family was not simply borrowing corn. Borrowed corn rarely came alone. It came with memory. It came with the understanding, held on both sides and never required to be spoken, that the borrowing had happened and that the Birch family knew when it had happened and under what circumstances. James understood this. She could see that he understood it. He said, "We ask Birch." She said, "Yes." He said, "We leave the seed corn alone." She said, "Yes." He pushed back from the table and went and got his coat and went outside. She watched him through the window cross the yard to the corn crib. His hand found the latch. He stood in the entrance for a moment. looking at what was inside, the same way she had stood in it an hour before. Then he stepped inside. She lost sight of him. After a minute he came back out. He pulled the door shut behind him. His right hand stayed on the latch after the door was closed, holding it the way a man holds something he is not quite ready to let go of. He stood in the cold yard with his hand on the latch. He stood there long enough that Margaret stopped watching and went back to the fire. Because some things needed to happen without anyone watching them happen. When she looked again, he was walking back toward the house. His hand was at his side. The door was closed. He had closed the door on the seed corn. A closed door was not the same as an answer. The 6 weeks still had to be lived through, one day at a time, on borrowed grain, and the decision not to touch what was in the corner of the crib. The 6 weeks did not care about the decision or the door or the conversation that had just happened in the kitchen. They were simply 6 weeks, arriving one morning at a time, requiring what they required. He came back inside and sat down at the table. She poured more water into his cup. Neither of them said anything else for a while, because there was nothing else to say that the silence was not already saying. And they had been married long enough to know the difference between a silence that needed to be filled and a silence that needed to be sat in. They sat in it. Reverend Aldous came on a Thursday in late January. He came on foot, which meant he had walked the 2 miles from the church road in the January cold without sending word ahead. Sending word ahead would have given James the opportunity to prepare himself in ways that would have made the visit less useful than Aldous intended it to be. James opened the door and found him on the step with his coat marked by the cold and his breath coming in small clouds. Aldous's expression carried the particular blend of warmth and purpose that he wore when he had decided something needed to be said and that he was the one who needed to say it. James invited him in. Margaret brought tea. Aldous sat at the table comfortably. With the ease of a man who had spent his adult life making himself at home in other people's houses because other people's houses were where his work happened. He was 55 years old and had been the minister of this parish for 19 years, and he knew the families in his parish, the way a man knows things he has paid attention to for a long time. He asked how the family was keeping. James said, "Well enough." "Thank you," Aldous asked after Hannah, having heard she had been unwell. James said she was recovered. "Doing well." Aldous said he was glad to hear it. He said winter illness was a hard thing, particularly for children, and that he had seen more of it than usual in the parish this year, which he attributed to the previous summer's difficulties having left people with less reserve than they normally carried into the cold months. He said this without looking at James directly. He was looking at his tea. James said that was probably right. Aldous drank his tea. He asked about the farm plan for the coming season, whether James was settled on his intentions for the spring planting, and James said he was. Mostly, that he had a plan worked out and was committed to it. Aldous nodded. He asked whether Calder had been accommodating in the November settlement, and James said that Calder had been reasonable, that they had arrived at an arrangement. Aldous said he was glad to hear that too. He put his cup down and looked at James now, directly, with the directness he deployed when he had finished the approach and arrived at the thing he had actually come to say. He said that the vestry had met in December and had reviewed the conditions of the parish going into winter. He said this had been a difficult autumn for a number of families in the district. The summer's weather and what it had done to crops had put several households in positions that were tighter than they were accustomed to. The vestry was aware of this and had discussed what the parish's responsibilities were in relation to it. He said there were mechanisms available to families in the parish who were experiencing hardship. The parish's machinery of public charity existed precisely for seasons like the one that had just passed. Using it was not a mark against a family, but was rather what the parish was for. The community caring for its members, in the way communities were meant to care for their members. He said all of this carefully, and without any implication that he was describing James's situation in particular, though they both understood that he said the vestry could arrange assistance. Corn, possibly. Some provision against the remaining winter months. James looked at the table. He looked at it for long enough that the silence became a kind of answer. And Aldous, who had sat through many such silences in many such kitchens over 19 years, recognized what kind of answer it was, and waited without pressing. James said he appreciated Aldous coming. He said he appreciated the vestry's concern and the parish's willingness to provide for its members. He said these were the things a good community did, and that he was grateful to be part of one that did them. Then he said that he believed the family was managing and that he did not think they would need to draw on the vestry's provision at this time. Aldous looked at him for a moment. He did not argue. He simply looked at James with the expression of a man who has heard this answer before and who knows what the answer costs the person giving it, and respects them enough not to make the cost larger by making it public. He said the offer stands. James said he understood and was grateful. Aldous finished his tea and stood and put his coat back on and shook James's hand and said to give his regards to Margaret and to tell Hannah he was glad she was on the mend. Then he walked back out into the January cold and down the path toward the church road, his dark coat moving through the bare trees until it was gone. James stood at the window and watched him go. Margaret came out of the kitchen. She asked what Aldous had said. James told her. He told her about the vestry meeting and the offer of provision and what he had said in response. He told her this factually, as a report on events. She listened. When he finished, she stood for a moment without speaking. Then she said the offer stands. She said it the way Aldous had said it, not as a question and not as a challenge, just as a repetition, a thing returned to the room where it could be looked at. James said yes. The offer stood. She looked at him. He understood what the look meant, which was not that she thought he had made the wrong decision, and not that she was going to tell him to reverse it. It was that she was making sure he understood what the decision had cost, and that the cost had been registered by someone other than himself. He said, "I know." She nodded once. She went back to the kitchen. James sat at the table. He thought about what it would mean to accept what Aldous had offered. He had thought about it many times since November. In that version of the winter, they had more corn. The seed corn in the corner of the crib was not a question yet. The gap between March and April was not something they had to solve with borrowed grain from a neighbor whose son had looked at Hannah at services. In that version, his name was in the vestry's records as a recipient of parish poor relief in the winter of 1721. The men who had authorized the provision were the same men he saw at services every Sunday and at county meetings and at the occasions that constituted the social life of this community. They were not bad men, and they would not speak of it beyond what was necessary. But they would know, and what people knew they carried into every subsequent interaction, into every assessment of a man's reliability and the prospects of his household. He understood this and accepted it, and did not try to make it more than it was or less than it was. He put on his coat and went out to ask Thomas Birch about borrowing corn. Margaret did not ask whether pride could feed them. She already knew the answer to that. The harder question was whether shame could cost them even more, and she was not yet certain of the answer, and she suspected she would not be certain for a long time, possibly longer than that. She went back to the fire. She put the pot on. She made what she had into what the family needed, the way she had been doing since July, one meal at a time, in the only kitchen she had, with the only hands available to do it. February came and did not hurry. This was the thing about February in Virginia that James had never fully made his peace with in 11 years of farming it. The way the month arrived and then simply stayed, day after day, each one cold and gray and largely indistinguishable from the one before it, without the quality of movement that other months had. October moved. November moved. Even January had the quality of something new. The first real cold, the adjustment to the short days. February had none of that. February was winter after the novelty had gone out of it. He had a cough. It had started in the second week of January, around the time Hannah was getting better, and he had assumed at first that he had caught what she had. It had not left. It had settled into his chest in the mild, persistent way of a thing that had decided it was comfortable there and was not in any particular hurry to move on. By February, it was simply part of the texture of his days. A low, dry sound that came out of him when he bent over or lifted something heavy or came in from the cold air outside. He did not mention it to Margaret. She tracked it the way she tracked everything, without appearing to track it, noting its presence each morning and its quality, and whether it was improving or doing something other than improving. It was doing something other than improving. It had stabilized somewhere short of better. It was there every morning, and there every evening, and there in the night sometimes. When the temperature in the house dropped in the hours before dawn, and James turned over in his sleep and the cold air found his lungs, she added it to the list of things she was managing without discussing. Eli had moved his bedding to the barn in the middle of January. He had presented this as a practical decision, which it partly was. The barn retained heat better than the house on the coldest nights because of the animals, and a person sleeping. There was a person not drawing from the fire in the main room. But Eli had also moved to the barn because he was 16, and there was a kind of discomfort he had developed in the house over the winter. A discomfort with being in a space where the pressures were visible in ways they had not been before, where his parents' faces in the evening told him things he had not been told directly, and that he was not sure he wanted to know. The barn was simpler. He came in for meals and for the evening and went back to the barn to sleep. And James said nothing about this arrangement, and Margaret said nothing about it, because both of them understood what it was, and neither of them had the energy in February to make it into something that required a conversation. Hannah had come back to herself after the illness, which was a relief that Margaret felt every morning when the girl came out of her room with her ordinary energy and her ordinary presence in the house. She was resilient in the way that children were resilient when they were basically healthy and had enough to eat. And both of those things were still true. Barely, but still true. She had also, since January, been quieter than usual. Not unhappy, simply paying more attention than she had before, watching the household with the eyes of a person who has recently understood that the household is a thing that can be watched, that has patterns and systems that are not visible unless you look for them. She had been looking for them since the night in August when she had watched her mother carry a bowl across the yard. She watched her father's face at meals. She watched her mother measure the cornmeal. She had made the same adjustments at the table that Eli had made, also without being asked, and she thought probably her mother had noticed and her father had not, and she thought this was probably fine. The corn from the Birch family had arrived in late January, brought by Thomas Birch's son in a wagon on a cold afternoon. Eli had helped him unload it and carry it to the crib, and the young man had been polite and efficient about the whole thing. When it was done, he had accepted a cup of tea from Margaret and sat for a few minutes, making the kind of conversation that people made in those circumstances, about the weather and the animals and the prospects for spring. He had looked at Hannah once while he was talking, a brief and carefully managed look. Hannah had looked back at him with the expression of a girl who has understood that she has been looked at and has not yet decided what she thinks about that. He left after the tea. The borrowed corn went into the crib next to the sealed bag of seed corn. The two of them, side by side, through the rest of January and into February. The corn you could eat and the corn you could not touch. Margaret checked on both every few days and made her calculations accordingly. The corn from the Birch family was going to get them to late March, better than the middle of March she had been looking at in January. Still not April, but better. And better was what you worked with when perfect was not available, which in February of 1721 was all the time. Nate moved through the winter the way he moved through every season, doing the work the farm required, the animal care and the wood cutting and the maintenance of the structures the cold weather tested. His portion had not been restored to what it had been before August. He had not expected it to be restored. He had his traps. There was a place along the creek bed, half a mile east, where a particular type of root grew through the winter that could be boiled and eaten. There was a hollow tree on the north edge of the property, where a family of squirrels had been living since October, and that he had not trapped through December and January because he had been waiting for February, when the animals inside would have eaten through most of their reserve, and the trap would not deprive them of what they needed to survive the last of the cold. In February, he set the trap. He did this in the mornings before the household was fully awake, working quietly in the cold, gray light before the sun was up. And what he brought back from these mornings went to a specific place in his building at the back of the property. Survival, for Nate, was not obedience. It was calculation performed where no one else was supposed to see it. He kept his own stores the way Margaret kept hers, quietly and without announcement. And the parallel between the two of them in this regard was something neither of them had ever named, and both of them understood. The evenings in February were the hardest, not because anything particular happened in the evenings. Nothing particular happened. The children did their work and went to their beds, and James sat at the table, sometimes with the ledger and sometimes without it, and Margaret sat with her spinning or her knitting, and the fire burned at the level Margaret had determined the fire should burn. And outside the February, dark pressed against the house, without urgency and without end. James and Margaret did not talk much in the evenings anymore. This was not a new silence. It was the accumulated weight of a winter's worth of things that had been said and not said, and known and not acknowledged, and decided and carried. And by February, it had reached the point where sitting together in the evening was its own form of communication. The communication of two people who have been through something together and are still going through it and have run out of new ways to describe it to each other. One evening in the last week of February, James came in from the yard later than usual, having stayed out after dark to check on one of the animals that had been off its feed for 2 days. He was cold all the way through when he came in, the kind of cold that takes a long time to leave. He sat down close to the fire, and Margaret brought him something warm without being asked, and sat across from him. They sat. The fire was at the level it was always at in the evenings now, low and steady, doing what it needed to do without excess. The candle on the table between them was the short kind, trimmed to use less tallow, and the light it threw was enough to see each other by. James looked at the fire. Margaret looked at the fire. The ledger sat closed on the table between them. They were still sitting there. That was the only thing that was certain tonight. Everything else, the debt that was still on the page, the land that was no longer theirs, the borrowed corn in the crib, the seed corn in its bag, the spring that was somewhere on the other side of February. All of it belonged to tomorrow. Tonight there was only the fire getting smaller and two people too tired to pretend they were not afraid. Margaret reached across and put her hand over his. She did not say anything. He turned his hand over and held hers. They sat like that until the candle burned down. April came the way it always came, not as a reward, not as a conclusion to anything. It came because it was the next thing after March, in the order that things came. Indifferent to what the winter had cost, and unaware of what it was being asked to follow. The frost went out of the ground in the first week, and the creek that ran along the south edge of the property picked up and ran faster with the melt, and the air changed in the way that Virginia air changed in April, losing the particular edge that February and March had given it, and becoming something softer, something that the body recognized as the beginning of the season where work outdoors was possible again, without the cold taking back half of what the work produced. James felt it when he stepped outside on the first genuinely warm morning. He stood in the yard and felt it, and did not make much of it, because he had felt it every April for 11 years, and he understood by now that warmth in April was not a promise. It was a condition. The warmth arrived, and the work began, and whether the work produced what it needed to produce depended on things the warmth had no opinion about. He had 130 acres now. The eastern 20 were gone, transferred in November to the arrangement with Calder. And the farm that remained was the farm it had been before he bought those acres. A farm that had been sufficient to support the family in most years, and that had been sufficient again this winter. Barely. With help from the Birch family that James intended to repay before the summer was out. He had a debt to Calder that was smaller than it had been in November, but still present, still on the page in Calder's book in Yorktown, still accumulating at the rate that debts accumulated, and he would need this season's crop to address it in a way that this past season had not been able to. He understood this. He went to the field. Eli was already there. This was the thing about Eli in the spring, that he came back to the work with something James could not entirely account for. Not the eagerness of a boy who had been kept indoors, but something more considered, more deliberate. He had come through the winter differently than James had expected him to. Not harder exactly, but with a quality that had not been there in the fall. a way of moving through the work that suggested he was thinking about it in a way he had not thought about it before. James had not asked him about it. He was not sure he knew how to ask. They worked the field together through the first week of April, turning the soil that had been dormant since October, preparing it for the seed. The work was familiar in the way that spring work was always familiar. The same tools and the same motions and the same earth responding in the same ways to the same actions. And there was a comfort in the familiarity that James had always taken from this particular kind of work. Nate was in the field too. He was working the far rows the way he always worked the far rows, moving through the turned soil with the steady attention he brought to every task. And the three of them, spread across the field in the April morning, made a picture that from a distance looked the same as it had looked every April for 6 years. 3 figures in a field getting the ground ready for what was coming. From a distance, it looked unchanged. It was not unchanged. Margaret watched from the garden, where she was preparing the kitchen beds for the early planting she had planned since February. She had planned the garden down to the placement of individual seeds. Which varieties, in which beds, at which intervals. And the plan had sustained her in the way that useful plans sustained her, by giving the future a shape she could work toward, rather than a formlessness she had to wait inside. She planted the first seeds of the year on a Tuesday morning in the second week of April. She pressed each one into the dark soil with the motion her hands knew without instruction. And she did not feel hope when she did it. Not in the bright way the word usually implied. She felt something more practical than that. Something closer to commitment. The commitment of a person who has decided that the next thing is going to be done and is doing it. Hannah came out to help in the middle of the morning. She came without being asked. She knelt beside her mother, and they worked the garden beds side by side, without talking much. Between them, over the winter, something had grown that Margaret had not known to expect, and that she was grateful for, in a way she had not found words for yet. James took the seed corn out of the crib on a Thursday morning and brought it to the field where he and Eli were going to plant the corn rows. He opened the bag, and they began to plant, walking the rows and pressing seed into the ground at the intervals James had been planting for 11 years. And the ground received the seed the way it always received it, without comment, without any indication of whether this was going to be a year that worked or a year that did not. Nate was planting the row beside James. They worked in the same direction, moving down their respective rows with the same motion, and the field was quiet, except for the sound of the work and the creek running to the south, and the birds that had come back with the warmth, filling the tree line with the noise of their returning. James planted and did not think about much, or rather, he thought about the things directly in front of him. The seed and the soil and the depth of the hole and the interval to the next one, and he let those things occupy the part of his mind that in other seasons had been occupied by the calculations he had been running since July. He was still running calculations. He would be running them until the crop came in. But he had been running them for 9 months, and he knew their shape by now, and they did not require his full attention to run. He pressed a seed into the ground. He moved to the next interval. He pressed another. At the end of the first day of planting, he stood at the edge of the field and looked at what had been done. The rows of turned earth, where the seed was now in the ground, and the evening light was coming across the field at the low angle of April evenings. The farm looked the way it looked at the end of a day of work. Used. Present. Still here. He went inside. Margaret had supper on, and the children were at the table, and Eli had come in from wherever he had gone after the planting, and they all sat down together the way they sat down every evening, in their places, around the same table. The meal was what April provided, which was enough to continue on. After supper, James sat with the ledger. He opened it. He turned to a new page and picked up his pen and wrote the date at the top. April 1721. Below the date he wrote the things that were true. The current debt to Calder, the debt to Birch for the corn, which he intended to repay by August, the field plan for the season, the number of acres in corn and the number in tobacco, and what each would need to produce for the year to come out in a position better than the year behind it. He wrote the numbers carefully, in the hand he used for numbers that mattered. When he was finished, he looked at what he had written. The numbers were not comfortable. They required the season to go reasonably well, which was not something he could guarantee, because it was not something that had ever been in his control to guarantee. They required things he could not know yet, and could not predict, and could only work toward. He closed the ledger. He left it on the table and went to the window and looked out at the field in the last of the April light. The planted rows, visible in the low angle of the sun, and beyond them, the tree line, and beyond that, the sky going from blue to the first color of evening, and the creek running to the south, the way it always ran. The corn crib was nearly empty. The river kept moving toward Yorktown. The ledger was not clean. And still, James Whitfield had put seed into the ground. He had not done it because he believed this year would be different from last year in all the ways that mattered. He had not done it because the calculations were comfortable, or the debt was gone, or the land was his the way it had been a year ago. He had done it because it was April, and April was when you planted, and the alternative to planting was a conclusion he was not prepared to reach. Outside, Nate was finishing something at the edge of the property in the last light, some task he had taken on at the end of the day. Without being asked, he moved along the fence line with the economy of someone who knew exactly what needed doing and was doing it. Then the light went, and he was just a shape at the edge of the field. And then the light went further, and he was not visible at all. The field was dark. The creek ran. A failed harvest in Colonial, Virginia, did not announce itself with drama. It arrived the way most things arrived, through a color that was slightly wrong on a leaf in July, a number that did not add up in a ledger at night, a door closed carefully on a bag of seed corn in January. By the time it was over, it had moved through every person on this farm. It had not moved through them equally. It had not moved through them in the same direction. It had not left them where it found them. James had learned that land could be both foundation and debt in the same season. Margaret had learned what she was willing to do without telling anyone, and that the list was longer than she had known. Eli had learned that a man could work correctly and still fail, and he was not yet sure what to do with that. Hannah had learned that adults measured things she had not known were being measured, and Nate had confirmed what he already knew, which was that when a household ran short, it ran short in a particular order, and the order was not random, and the people at the bottom of the order were the people who had been placed there before the shortage began. The land did not remember what it had taken. It only waited to see what they would ask of it again. Spring in Colonial, Virginia, was not a reward. It was not a second chance. It was simply the next thing, arriving on its own schedule, asking only one question of the people who remained. Are you still here? They were still here. That was not nothing. It was also not enough to call it saved.